Hey, welcome along to another one of our weekend shows. The historian Amity Shlaes is here with us. She wrote a terrific biography of Coolidge a couple of years ago, although that's not what we're going to be talking about today. One of the great themes of the November election was that it was about the forgotten man. The forgotten man. The forgotten man pushed back in November. Kellyanne Conway from the Trump administration said it was this election was all about the forgotten man. Forgotten man this, forgotten man that, forgotten man the other. We're going to look at where that phrase comes from, and one of the artifacts that helped plant it in the language 80 years ago, actually, as it happens, comes from a film. Music by Harry Warren, words by Al Dubin. If you only know Joan Blondell from the diner in Greece, this is when she was really cooking.
Remember my forgotten man? You put a rifle in his hand. You sent him far away. You shouted, hip hooray! But look at him today.
When I first saw Gold Diggers in 1933, when I was a kid, I knew what the Depression was, I knew what the Great War was, but I didn't really understand there was a whole historical baggage around the phrase, my forgotten man. As Joan Blondell was singing about. And I thought we'd unpack that since it's come back for the dawn of the Trump presidency, and there's no one better to talk about it than the best-selling author, by which I mean not just regular books full of words, but actually also best-selling graphic books too, Amity Shlaes. And Amity wrote a book called The Forgotten Man. And Harry Warren and Al Dubin had a hit song with the title. You had a hit book and a hit graphic book about it. And it comes back, it recurs every couple of generations in American life, but the meaning shifts. So let's talk about what it meant originally in 1883 or thereabouts.
Well, that's right, Mark. It's a meme. It's an American meme, forgotten man. There was a philosopher who is himself forgotten named William Graham Sumner. And Sumner had a little algebra to describe his forgotten man. He said A at the top wants to help X at the bottom. All right, charity. B wants to help X at the bottom. But there might be a problem when A and B get together and pass a law that coerces some third party, C, into funding their perhaps good, but perhaps dubious project for X. And Sumner said, C, the taxpayer, is the forgotten man, the man who pays, the man who prays, the man who is not thought of. And they all knew that. Man who pays, man who prays, right. Not thought of. Middle class man, man carrying the burden of the social project. And for 40 or 50 years, that was the American forgotten man.
Now, if we flash forward the best part of half a century then to round about the time Joan Blondell sang that 2 months after the inauguration of FDR, and the phrase has evolved in a slightly sinister way.
Well, that's right. Franklin Roosevelt was a master memesman. He knew how to turn a phrase and turn the meaning. And this was in the Great Depression. 2 in 10 men were unemployed. So the forgotten man was obviously the poor man. We all have charity in our hearts for the poor man. And so Roosevelt said, the forgotten man at the bottom of the pyramid, it's a group we need to help. And of course, we did need to help the forgotten man. The question was how. The way he moved on to helping the group of the poor is he said, I'll do the poor, I'll do the worker, I'll do the aged, I'll do the ill. That is group by group by group, which is actually the opposite of the original forgotten man, who is the anonymous collateral damage to some social project.
Right, so in Sumner's day, to go back to his formula, where A and B gang up to get C to pay for X, FDR decides X is in fact the forgotten man, and C, who is like the 1883 feed store owner who's getting taxed to pay for X. Roosevelt, in fact, has little or no interest in that Class C group of people, of small business owners.
Roosevelt forgets the original forgotten man. And even beyond being a group, say the taxpayer or the small business, he's the person who happens to be collateral damage to a social project. And that person we all know. You have 6 children, not 3, or your income's too high, so you don't get a certain tax rake. Projects that are targeted to groups always leave someone out and also lend themselves to cronyism, which hurts others, the anonymous person. So Roosevelt completely flipped the meaning of the forgotten man to be a remembered group, as in the Democratic Party or the Social Democratic parties in Europe. Let's reward this group, that group, particularly groups that might seem vulnerable, and always forgot the general economy and the taxpayer or someone who might not even be identifiable.
Well, you use that phrase collateral damage, which is one of those faintly evasive military terms to describe, you're trying to hit a jihadist in the Hindu Kush and you accidentally hit some Afghan wedding going on half a mile down the road or whatever. But in one of the shocking aspects of your book, in some respects, is the way it doesn't always seem collateral. It seems as if they quite deliberately targeted the Group C, the people who would fall into Sumner's Group C, pour encourager les autres. In other words, to single out a dry cleaner or a store owner and make an example of them to instruct them in the power of the new central government. That's
right. The resentment is the fuel. So you say, I really want to help the poor person, and by the way, we're going to kick that fellow on the side. And that makes us feel better and gives us energy and perhaps funding for this other project. So it's quasi-intentional. Sometimes it can be, I'll just leave him out. I don't care about him or her. That person is wealthy enough. Sumner, we're talking a name that we don't always hear in the U.S. William, let me say it again. I use it for a password. William Graham Sumner. William Graham Sumner, because he was a fantastic philosopher in the free market classical liberal tradition, and he's absolutely forgotten himself now. Sumner said the redistributive state is evil, and that's really what you're talking about, Mark. Let's take from him to pay her and feel righteous about it.
And he, in a sense, he was in on the kind of the early definition of concepts we're familiar with today, like crony capitalism, which he used the term jobbery, which is it kind of gets to the same thing, an unhealthy relationship between people who have the ear of the state and those who don't.
Yes, what's brilliant about the term jobbery, that's what he called crony capitalism, is that you pick up from the name that the job might not be that productive.
Right.
Let's build a bridge to nowhere because we feel like it. Do they need the bridge? Maybe, maybe not. It's generation of work. Maybe nowadays it would be on the Keynesian principle that spending is always good, which it isn't. And it's suspicious of the productivity of a politically driven economic project. And Sumner was dead by the New Deal, by the 1930s. But his analysis worked because the forgotten man of the New Deal period, the 30s, the Great Depression, the reason we remember it was the general economy. The American was forgotten because unemployment was just about always over 10% for a decade because of this social democracy we developed.
Well, and again, just to go back to that term, jobbery, as a kind of term for faintly artificial jobs. We see that all over the economy today. For example, the teachers' unions who are currently objecting to Betsy DeVos as education secretary. We have the lowest teacher-pupil ratio in history. We spend more than any other developed nation. We have nothing. We have nothing to show for it. In the international league tables, our children come lower and lower the longer and longer they spend in the system, and that's because there are millions and millions of people under the so-called term educators who are in fact just occupying positions, privileged positions, that a powerful lobby group has negotiated with the state rather than actually doing a productive job. So he was ahead of his time in advancing that.
He was so far ahead of his time, Sumner, that I hope he is taught.
Right.
If you go to Yale University, where he was so famous that his name was a verb to
Right.
Sumnerize,
Right,
I'm taking Sumner and
yeah.
so on. He was the Thomas Piketty of his day. That is a well-known economist, beloved of youth. You will find scant trace of Sumner now. And I'm hoping Yale will bring back the William Graham Sumner Center one day to warrant the distinction of this great professor who's kind of whitewashed out of history.
Well, as you say, he didn't live to see the way. FDR and those around him seem to have understood that this is a powerful concept, the forgotten man, and they took it and they ran with it and they turned the meaning on its head. And your book, The Forgotten Man, you pull a little switcheroo on the reader. You begin with these vignettes of desperate people in desperate plights. A 13-year-old boy whose father has lost his job, whose big sister can't get a job as a waitress, and he kills himself at the age of 13. And where we start reading all these, reading your book, thinking these poignant vignettes are from somewhere between the Wall Street crash and the FDR inauguration. And then you tell us a couple of pages on, no, this is actually 1937. This is half a decade into the New Deal, and people are still desperate. In other words, the forgotten man in the FDR era turned out to be exactly the same as Sumner's. That the people FDR chose to forget were Group C, the guy who pays, the guy who wants a job, the guy who doesn't want to be a government dependent.
Well, that's right. Why does it matter? Because the 1930s are the model for government intervention. We all learned in school or on television or via The Great Gatsby that, let's see, wealth is bad and depression comes and only government can rescue the economy through stimulus.
Yeah.
That's what was the model for the recent crisis, right? After 2008, stimulus. I see Bloomberg was editorializing just this week about how stimulus saved us. Stimulus doesn't always save us. That's what in the 30s there was stimulus. It didn't work that well.
No.
Well, some perversely argue it should have been even greater stimulus. I don't personally buy that. The Great Depression was terrible because of government intervention, not because of the absence of it. And our schools don't convey that. Right. Very hard for them to ever. Kids can grow up without ever hearing even that argument, which is why this is something that must be argued both sides. It's absolutely gone.
And he's still our mutual friend, Conrad Black, wrote a biography of Franklin Roosevelt. He loves Franklin Roosevelt. He regards Franklin Roosevelt as the man who saved capitalism, and then the man who, in the Second World War, saved civilization. To some of us, Franklin Roosevelt is the man who subverted the small government principles of the American Republic and then abroad subverted the British Empire, not to the benefit of post-war peoples in continents across the world. What's Conrad missing about his pal Franklin in that respect?
Conrad cares about World War II. And Roosevelt was on the right side of World War II, most of us believed, the enemy. the Nazis. Maybe he was naive about the Soviets. Some of us would argue that. But he was on the right side. So he was a good war hero. He was a Navy president. You know, FDR was a fantastic sailor.
Right.
He was like an admiral, though he never had that rank.
Yeah.
And he was good at that war in many ways. He understood what was going on. So he saved civilization. You can make that argument, and I believe that's what Mr. Conrad is focusing on. So he's looking away, Conrad,
right.
and if he were here, he'd be mightily offended. So that would be fun and tell me try and tell me to go away.
Right.
But I'll tell him to go away, Conrad, because the 30s evidence is so strong.
So strong.
If you just look at the data points to the analytic, the stock market in the 1930s never came back.
No.
The unemployment never went down. Well, as Americans and humane creatures, we care a lot about unemployment. That's the #1 meter, right?
Right.
If unemployment is above 10%, then the social program is failing the people.
Yeah.
That's the evidence, no question. It was not all monetary. You can't work it that way, though some economists will argue it was all monetary. Even Milton Friedman would not say the entire 1930s troubles were due to monetary.
No.
There's an alternate, along with Sumner, since we're revising. When I teach students and I teach myself, I came across an economist from the 1930s named Benjamin Anderson, who wrote the Chase newsletter for the Chase Bank. He was a mainstream economist at the time, and he wrote commentary every week. Well, the new high labor price mandated by the government and the new minimum wage laws seems to be having a dampening effect on rehiring. This is a pity. You don't need to stentorian yell back at them what happened. The evidence was all there. It's just we didn't learn it. And likewise, I don't think many people in the UK know the negative effects of the Labour government in the 1920s.
No.
But they do know that they don't use the word dole, which is welfare, because it became a pejorative.
Right.
Because the dole was so terrible for workers in the UK. They didn't get a job or they didn't want one. And UK had double-digit unemployment for 2 decades, not one.
No.
As you've talked about that.
No. And you see signs of this government intervention all over the place. In my corner of New Hampshire, when they electrified it, because it was done at the behest as a kind of government stimulus, they put the ridge poles along, they put the electric poles along the ridge lines of the mountains, so that if ever there's a power outage, the trucks have to sort of hack like 4 miles into the woods to get to the pole to fix it. But it was a kind of, that was a kind of a government stimulus view of how you electrify a neighborhood. It's not what a normal electrical company would have done. There's strange residues from the New Deal programs.
Well, absolutely. And remember that electricity was the internet of the period.
Yeah.
Even in the dark Great Depression, every year, power use went up. It was depression-proof because it was so exciting. So it was the fracking of its era. It could have lifted the economy out, notwithstanding no matter what, right? And instead, the government took it over, first through the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was a new entity in that period, through rural electrification, which that may well be the program that put the post in the wrong place, because rural electrification was political, jobbery. We want to help the distant town, and they will vote for me. So regardless of how inefficient that is in terms of creating a grid. They also outlawed private companies or severely constrained them through the Public Utilities Holding Company Act, which was called the Death Sentence Act for the private companies. So the government took over a good industry like the internet or fracking and pushed out the private sector. And I was stunned to see this, and it sort of carries the story of the forgotten man in this history of the 30s, because I found one who spake truth to power. That was Wendell Willkie, the utilities executive, the angry businessman. And he had a good company that was electrifying the rural South. That was the main issue. And he said, you're squeezing us out and our shareholders are losing money and they're going into a depression, and not all of those old ladies are rich.
Right.
So what are you doing? You're hurting my forgotten ladies, the old pension ladies, for your so-called people's program of power, President Roosevelt. I don't think President Roosevelt needs to be vilified. His damage, however, needs to be recognized.
Well, you mentioned Wendell Willkie there, who I suppose could have been a Trump-like figure in his day. And you write a book called The Forgotten Man, and a couple of years later, you're sitting around at home, and one day you hear Donald Trump on the TV or the radio or whatever, and the phrase is back. And Donald Trump, about 6 months before the election, suddenly started using this phrase again, the forgotten man. And you've given us two views of the forgotten man, the 1883 version and the 1933 version. And you wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal a few months before the election, kind of wondering which way Donald Trump would go. Which forgotten man did he mean? Do you have an answer to that yet?
I can't answer that because President Trump hasn't answered it yet. I'm not sure he's made up his mind. So he has a penchant for groups and specific projects, which can inspire infrastructure.
Right.
But he also has a penchant for the outsider and the individual. And you can see in his nominees both impulses. So he hasn't made up his mind.
But just to flip it around, look at it from the other party's point of view, and to come back to what you were saying about collateral damage, as it were, it did seem in this last election, and we saw this to an extent within the Hillary Clinton campaign, when Bill Clinton started saying, well, why don't we send her to Michigan, and why don't we send her to Pennsylvania? And the people close to Hillary said, no, those guys who voted for you, Bill, they're gone and they're never coming back. As if the Democrats took a conscious decision to consciously forget an entire demographic at the cost of more fashionable identity groups, the coalition of the ascendant, which is Hispanics and gays and Muslims and transgendered and far more modish and fashionable groups, and these kind of old, white, boring people who used to work in factories and who now have to make do with crummy $8 an hour service jobs at the convenience store. They're gone, they're never coming back, who cares, they'll be dead soon. It seemed a much more conscious write-off even than in FDR's time, don't you think?
Yes, it was a conscious error.
Right.
Well, FDR did go to the factory worker. I think in her first campaign, in a preceding presidential campaign, Hillary Clinton had Harold Ickes, the son of the New Dealer, Harold Ickes, and they went after groups. This time she had groups, but as you say, Mark, new groups. And probably she, in terms of politics, might have spent more time in some of the states where there were the old groups, including the worker who might be unionized. And there were unionized workers who voted for Trump as they had for Reagan. Why did they do that if this was not the union president? Because they saw union people have a good understanding of the overall economy often. And they saw that Reagan might have more hope for jobs generally, even if he wasn't a union man anymore. And that's the same for Trump. A rising tide does lift all boats, even union boats. And if you've worked in the business cycle, you know that. That was an error of hers.
Well, let me come back to where we started on this with that big song from Gold Diggers of 1933. Those guys wrote a lot of. It's a pre-depression, pre-movie code musical. So it's got a lot of underdressed chorus girls in it. It's got a lot of tap dancing, but at the same time, they recognized that there was something marketable in this idea of the forgotten man. And when Jack Warner saw the rough cut of the picture, that song was somewhere in the middle, and he said, no, move that up to the end, it's great, and they moved Pettin in the Park back to be lost somewhere in there. So they understood that. A couple of years ago, you did a graphic version of The Forgotten Man with a terrific artist. Why did you do, in a sense, you were doing something similar to what Warner Brothers did in turning the concept into a song. You turned it into a comic book, which is what that's a fancy, graphic novel is a fancy term for a comic book, basically. Why did you do that, Amity?
I did it because The Forgotten Man is such an important concept that maybe books alone cannot carry him. So I like the graphic novel very much. I see, for an example of a graphic novel that impressed me was Persepolis, about the Iranian Revolution. It's from the point of view of a Muslim girl.
Yeah.
And her parents think the revolution means freedom, and it turns out to mean the opposite. And I could see that this difficult topic, the Iranian Revolution, was conveyed to millions because it came in cartoons. And I'm not against cartoons, they're brilliant. So another example would be Mouse, the book about the Holocaust. And my husband, Seth Lipsky, knew the artist for Mouse. And we were told, oh, there's this cartoon, we're going to tell about the Holocaust with mice and cats, and the Jews are going to be mice, and the Germans are going to be cats, and the Poles are going to be pigs. Right. Well, that's offensive on a million levels. Okay, but this cartoon book, Mouse, which did that, taught the Holocaust, a very difficult topic, to millions who otherwise never would have taken it in. So I said, someone said to me, cartoons are the gateway drug to knowledge. And I'm good with that. The gateway drug to knowledge. So the New Deal and its failure and The Forgotten Men are so important. If I can get to 100,000 more, especially younger people, I'm really going to invest in that. And I want to say that the artist, Paul Rivoche, who's Canadian, he's from Toronto, and has some experience thinking about the Soviet Union, which is drawn in this book too, and the incredible devastation there, did a fantastic job. And so did Chuck Dixon, who helped us figure out the plot, basically the writer man for the book. So this was a very big investment to do Forgotten Men in cartoons, and we're honored that it made #1 on the New York Times cartoon category bestseller list and is taught in some schools. We are ready to help you teach Forgotten Man graphic if you're a teacher or you use it in homeschooling. But it's just a trial. It's one book.
No, but it's a great thing to do, and as I said, it's the same thing as Harry Warren and Al Dubin did with that song in 19. If you've got something that's a strong concept, if you've got a strong concept, you want to do it in the most accessible form, and that's whether it's a 1933 song or a 21st century graphic novel.
Well, that's right. New ventures are brave and costly. This show is a new venture. It's brave and costly, but it's imperative because culture isn't always getting conveyed.
No.
So the carriage, that's our job. And let us try in every way. I'm deeply impressed with Hamilton. I've seen it twice. The board of the Coolidge Foundation has seen it where I'm the chair, because we need to convey Calvin Coolidge and William Graham Sumner as Hamilton was conveyed by this wonderful musical.
Well, thanks a lot, Amity Shlaes. And if you haven't read The Forgotten Man, do pick it up, either in book form, for those of you who are quaint enough to like words, or in graphic novel form.